The old cowboy and the Apache widow, the bullet whistled past Jake's ear before he even heard the gunshot. He dove behind the water trough, his weathered hands reaching for the revolver at his hip. 63 years old, and his reflexes still worked, though his knees screamed in protest as he hit the dirt. The second shot splintered wood above his head, sending splinters raining down on his gray hair. Across the dusty street, a woman stood motionless on the porch of the abandoned trading post. She wore traditional Apache clothing, her long black hair streaked with silver, and she held a rifle steady as a rock. Jake recognized her immediately. Maria, widow of the Apache chief who died 3 winters ago, the same woman whose husband had once saved Jake's life during the blizzard 20 years back. Why was she shooting at him? A third shot kicked up dust near his boot. Jake rolled left, using the trough for cover, and called out in broken Apache. His throat was dry, the words rusty from disuse. He asked her to stop, told her he meant no harm. Her response was another bullet that punched through the trough, sending water gushing onto the ground. Jake's mind raced. He'd ridden into this ghost town looking for shelter from the storm brewing on the horizon. The dark clouds had been chasing him for miles, and this place, once a thriving outpost, seemed like the only option. He hadn't expected anyone to be here, let alone Maria. She shouted something in Apache. Jake caught only fragments. Something about thieves.
About her son. About blood that needed answering.
His heart sank. Her son Tommy was a good kid, half Apache, half white, trying to make his way in a world that didn't want him in either camp. Jake had met him once, years ago, when the boy was barely 10. Now he'd be, 15, 16? Another shot rang out, this one closer. The woman was moving, circling around to get a better angle. Jake had maybe 30 seconds before she had a clear line of sight. He couldn't shoot her. Even if his conscience would allow it, which it wouldn't, there was the debt he owed her dead husband. The man had found Jake half frozen in a ravine, had carried him 5 miles through a snowstorm to his camp, had nursed him back to health over 2 weeks. Jake made a decision. He stood up, hands raised high, his revolver dangling from one finger by the trigger guard. It was a fool's gamble, but sometimes being a fool was the only honest choice left. Maria's rifle tracked him instantly. Her finger was on the trigger, her eyes hard as flint, but she didn't fire. Jake spoke slowly, carefully, in English this time. He told her he didn't know what happened to Tommy, but he'd help her find out. He told her about the debt he owed, about his respect for her husband's memory. He told her the truth, that he was just an old cowboy looking for a place to wait out a storm, nothing more. The wind picked up, howling through the empty buildings. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy. Maria's rifle wavered slightly. Jake could see the conflict in her eyes, grief and rage warring with reason. She'd lived through decades of broken promises from white men. Why should she believe him? Then she lowered the rifle, just an inch. Her voice came out harsh and broken. Tommy was missing for 3 days now. 5 men had ridden through 2 weeks ago, white men with hard eyes and cruel laughs. They'd camped near her land. Tommy had gone to town for supplies and never came back. She'd tracked the men here, to this dead place, but lost their trail in the rocks beyond. Jake lowered his hands slowly. The rain was coming harder now, turning the street to mud. He knew those men. Had seen them in the last town, playing cards and talking loud about a big score waiting in the mountains. Mean customers, every one of them. The kind who'd think nothing of hurting a half-breed kid for sport. He told Maria he'd seen them, told her which direction they'd headed. Her eyes locked onto his, searching for deception. Finding none, she finally nodded. The storm broke overhead with a crack of thunder that shook the ground. Maria gestured toward the trading post. They'd wait out the weather, she indicated, then track the men at first light. Jake picked up his hat from the mud and followed her, his old bones aching but his purpose clear. Finding Tommy had just become the most important thing in his world. Inside the trading post, water dripped through holes in the roof. Maria set a rifle against the wall and began gathering wood for a fire. Jake watched her move with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime surviving against odds that would break most people. She was maybe 50, he guessed, though hardship made age difficult to judge. Her hands were scarred from work, her face lined but strong. They didn't speak as she got the fire going. The silence stretched between them, filled with rain and distant thunder. Jake found a relatively dry corner and checked his supplies. He had enough jerky and hardtack for 3 days, maybe 4 if they stretched it. His ammunition was low, only 12 rounds left. If they ran into serious trouble, that wouldn't be nearly enough. Maria finally spoke, her English accented but clear. She asked if Jake had children. He shook his head. Had a wife once, long ago, but she died of fever before they could start a family. Been alone ever since, just him and his horse and the endless horizon? Maria nodded slowly. She understood loneliness, the way it could become a companion in itself. She told him about Tommy. The boy was smart. Too smart for his own good sometimes. He taught himself to read from old newspapers, could do arithmetic in his head faster than most adults. He dreamed of becoming a teacher, of building a school where Apache and white children could learn together. Foolish dreams, maybe, but Maria couldn't bring herself to crush them. Hope was too precious a thing, even when it hurt. The fire crackled and popped. Outside, the storm raged on. Jake cleaned his revolver methodically, checking each chamber, each mechanism. Tomorrow they'd need to be ready for anything. Those 5 men wouldn't give up Tommy easily, assuming he was still alive. Jake pushed that dark thought away. The boy had to be alive. Had to be. Lightning flashed, illuminating Maria's face. In that brief moment, Jake saw the weight she carried. Not just grief for her husband, not just fear for her son, but the accumulated burden of a lifetime spent watching her people pushed to the margins, watching the world change in ways that left no place for them.
Yet she endured.
She survived. She fought. Jake made a silent promise to her dead husband, to himself. They'd find Tommy, and those 5 men would answer for whatever they'd done. The storm hammered the roof above their heads as they settled in for a long, sleepless night. Tomorrow, the real hunt would begin. And Jake, despite his age and his aching bones, felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. A reason to keep going. Sometimes that was all a man needed, old cowboy or not. Dawn broke gray and sullen over the desert. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp. Jake's joints protested as he stood, but he ignored them. He'd been ignoring pain for so long it had become background noise. Maria was already outside studying the ground where the rain had washed away most signs of passage, but she knew tracking like Jake knew horses. Within minutes, she'd found what she was looking for. The 5 men had indeed come through here. Their tracks led northeast, toward the canyon country where 1,000 hiding places waited among the red rocks and twisted arroyos. It was harsh territory, unforgiving to those who didn't know it. Lucky for them, Maria knew every inch of this land. Her people had lived here for generations before the word Apache even existed. They set out on foot, leading Jake's horse. The animal was tired from yesterday's hard ride, and the terrain ahead was too rough for riding anyway. Maria moved with confidence, her eyes constantly scanning the ground, the rocks, the distant ridges. She read the land like Jake read faces, seeing stories in every disturbed stone and broken branch. Hours passed in silence. The sun climbed higher, turning the world into a furnace. Jake's canteen was half empty when Maria suddenly stopped. She knelt, examining something Jake couldn't see. When she stood, her face was grim. She pointed to a dark stain on a rock. Blood. Dried but not old. Maybe 2 days. Jake's gut clenched. Was it Tommy's blood? Maria didn't speculate. She simply adjusted course, following a new trail that diverged from the main tracks. Someone had split off from the group here, or been dragged. The signs were subtle but clear to her trained eyes. They entered a narrow canyon where the walls rose high on either side, blocking the sun and creating a twilight gloom even at midday. The air was cooler here, damp from water that seeped from cracks in the stone. Maria moved more cautiously now, her hand never far from her rifle. Jake loosened his revolver in its holster. This was good ambush country. If the men were smart, they'd have a lookout posted. A sound echoed off the canyon walls. Voices, faint but distinct. Maria froze, then motioned for Jake to follow her up a side path that climbed the canyon wall. They moved slowly, careful not to dislodge loose rocks. The climb was brutal on Jake's old legs, but he kept pace through sheer stubbornness. At the top, they had a view into a natural amphitheater formed by the surrounding cliffs. Below, 4 men sat around a fire, passing a bottle between them. Jake counted twice to be sure. 4 men, not 5. Where was the last one? And more importantly, where was Tommy? Maria's hand tightened on her rifle. She'd seen what Jake had. One of the men stood stretching, and Jake got a good look at his face. Pete Carson, a drifter and part-time cattle thief he'd seen in the last town. Mean drunk with a reputation for violence. The kind of man who'd kick a dog just to watch it yelp. The other 3 were strangers to Jake, but they had the same hard, empty look. Men who'd crossed too many lines to ever come back. Then Jake saw the cave entrance behind the camp, partially hidden by an overhang. A 5th figure emerged, carrying firewood. Younger, slimmer than the others. Even from this distance, Jake could see the bruising on his face. Tommy, The boy was alive. Maria saw him the same instant. Her entire body tensed like a drawn bowstring. Jake put a hand on her arm, holding her back. They were outnumbered and outgunned. A direct assault would get them killed and do Tommy no good. They needed a plan. Maria shook off his hand, anger flashing in her eyes. That was her son down there, hurt and captive. Every second they waited was another second he suffered. Jake understood, but understanding didn't change mathematics. 5 against 2 were bad odds, even if one of the 5 was just a beaten kid who probably couldn't fight. Jake thought fast. The canyon had only one way out that they'd seen, the way they'd come in. If they could block it, trap the men inside, they might be able to negotiate, or wait them out. But Maria wasn't in a waiting mood, and Jake knew it. She'd charge down there alone if he didn't come up with something better. He studied the camp layout carefully. The fire was near the center, the men relaxed and unguarded. They clearly didn't expect trouble out here. That overconfidence could be used against them. Jake noticed a stack of supplies near the cave entrance, including what looked like kegs of black powder. Prospectors' equipment, probably stolen. The men must be planning to blast open some promising rock face, looking for gold or silver. An idea formed. Dangerous, maybe stupid, but possible. Jake explained it to Maria in whispers. Her eyes widened, then narrowed with calculation. She didn't like it. The risk to Tommy was too high, but she couldn't deny the logic. Sometimes you had to gamble everything on one desperate play. They separated, Maria circling around to the east while Jake made his way west. The plan required timing and luck, neither of which were guaranteed. Jake reached his position, a narrow ledge overlooking the camp from the opposite side. He could see Maria's shape, barely visible among the rocks across from him. She raised one hand, signaling ready. Jake picked up a stone and threw it hard, bouncing it off the canyon wall behind the men. All 4 jumped up, hands going to weapons, staring in the wrong direction. In that moment of confusion, Maria fired. Not at the men, but at the ground near the powder kegs. Sparks flew. The men shouted and dove away from their supplies. Jake added his voice to the chaos, yelling in the deepest, most authoritative tone he could manage. He claimed they were surrounded by 20 armed men, federal marshals tracking the gang for multiple murders. It was a complete lie, but delivered with enough conviction to make desperate men believe. He ordered them to release the boy and surrender. Pete Carson recovered first. He grabbed Tommy, pulling him in front as a shield, a knife at the boy's throat. He screamed up at the invisible marshals, threatening to kill the hostage if they didn't back off. Jake cursed silently. This was the outcome he'd feared. Maria didn't hesitate. Her rifle cracked again, the bullet striking stone inches from Pete's foot. She shouted in Apache, her words carrying ancient authority. Jake didn't understand most of it, but he caught the essential meaning. She was calling on spirits, on the land itself, promising vengeance not just in this life, but in all lives to come. It was theater, but effective theater. The men were spooked, looking around wildly at the empty rocks. Jake pressed the advantage. He fired a shot that ricocheted off the canyon wall, deliberately missing but sounding like it came from yet another direction. He varied his voice, shouting different commands as if multiple people were coordinating an assault. The men bunched together, trying to watch all directions at once, their formation breaking apart in confusion. Tommy made his move. The boy wasn't as helpless as he'd seemed. He drove his elbow back into Pete's ribs, hard, then dropped straight down as Pete's grip loosened. Maria's next shot wasn't a warning. It took Pete in the shoulder, spinning him around. Jake fired at another man who was raising his weapon, the bullet catching him in the leg. The remaining 2 men broke and ran, heading for the canyon exit. Jake let them go. Getting Tommy safe was the priority. Maria was already climbing down, moving with reckless speed. Jake followed more carefully, his old bones protesting the rapid descent. By the time Jake reached the canyon floor, Maria had Tommy in her arms. The boy was crying, though trying not to show it. His face was badly bruised, one eye swollen shut, but he was alive and conscious. He kept apologizing in a mixture of English and Apache, saying he'd been stupid to travel alone, that he should have been more careful. Pete Carson was on the ground, clutching his wounded shoulder, cursing steadily. The other wounded man had dragged himself toward the cave, leaving a blood trail. Jake checked both of them quickly. Neither wound was immediately fatal, though they'd need medical attention soon. He took their weapons, tossing them into a pile out of reach. Maria was examining Tommy, checking for injuries beyond the obvious facial damage. The boy's ribs were bruised badly, maybe cracked, and he limped on his left leg. But nothing seemed broken beyond repair. He'd survive, though he'd carry the memory of this for the rest of his life. Jake found rope in the supplies and tied up Pete Carson, then helped Maria secure the other wounded man. The two who'd run might bring help, might bring more trouble, but for now they had breathing room. He gathered up the gang's horses, 5 decent animals that would fetch a good price in town. Stolen property probably, but that wasn't his concern right now. Tommy finally managed to tell them what happened. The 5 men had grabbed him on the road to town, thinking he knew where Apache gold was hidden. Old legends die hard in the desert, stories of treasure buried by Geronimo or Cochise. The boy had told them repeatedly there was no gold, but they hadn't believed him. They'd beaten him, threatened worse, all for a fantasy that never existed. Maria's face was stone as she listened. Jake saw her hand tremble slightly as she stroked Tommy's hair, the only sign of the emotion raging beneath her control. She'd almost lost him to greed and stupidity and the casual cruelty that seemed to follow her people everywhere. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the canyon walls orange and red. They needed to move. Pete Carson and his wounded companion couldn't be left here to die, much as they might deserve it. Jake made a travois from branches and canvas, something to drag them on behind the horses. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would get them to the nearest town where a law could deal with them properly. They worked through the evening, preparing for the journey ahead. Tommy insisted on helping despite his injuries, needing to prove he wasn't helpless. Maria let him, understanding that pride sometimes matters more than comfort. Jake stayed quiet, letting mother and son reconnect in their own way. That night, they camped at the canyon entrance under stars that blazed like distant fires. Tommy was asleep almost immediately, exhausted by pain and relief. Maria sat beside Jake, staring into their small fire. She thanked him, the words simple but weighted with meaning. Jake shrugged it off. He'd only done what was right, what her husband would have done for him without question. Maria shook her head. Most men wouldn't have risked their lives for an Apache boy. Wouldn't have seen Tommy as worth saving. The fact that Jake did, that he'd put himself in danger for a stranger's child, meant something. It meant maybe the world wasn't entirely cruel. Maybe there was still space for honor and decency, even in hard times. Jake poked at the fire with a stick, uncomfortable with praise. He'd spent his whole life trying to do right, and failing more often than not. This time, though, they'd succeeded. The boy was safe, and that had to count for something. It had to matter. They talked long into the night, sharing stories about the old days when the frontier was wider and the rules less certain. Maria told him about her husband, about the wisdom he'd carried and the sadness that came from watching his way of life disappear. Jake talked about the young man he'd been, full of dreams about what the West could become, and the old man he'd turned into, watching most of those dreams turn to dust. But not all dreams died, Maria pointed out. Tommy dreamed of a different future, one where people judged each other by character rather than blood. That dream was still alive, still possible, as long as people like them kept believing in it. Jake wanted to argue, to point out all the ways the world seemed determined to prove her wrong. But looking at Tommy's sleeping face, peaceful despite everything, he found he couldn't. Maybe she was right. Maybe hope was just stubbornness by another name. And if anyone understood stubbornness, it was an old cowboy who'd spent 63 years refusing to quit. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence. Two people who'd found unexpected alliance in a harsh land. Tomorrow they'd start the long journey to town. Tonight they'd rest and be grateful for what they'd saved. The journey to town took 3 days through unforgiving country. Pete Carson complained constantly about his wound, demanding they stop, demanding water, demanding comfort he'd never shown his victims. Jake ignored him. Maria was less patient, occasionally telling him in sharp Apache exactly what she thought of him. The wounded man with the leg injury stayed quiet, perhaps realizing how close he'd come to dying and wanting to keep whatever luck he had left. Tommy rode in front of Maria on her horse, still too hurt to sit a saddle alone. He was tougher than he looked, making it through each day without much complaint. He talked sometimes about his plans, his dreams of that school he wanted to build. Jake listened and asked questions, treating the boy's ideas with respect rather than dismissal. He'd learned long ago that dreams were worth encouraging, even impossible ones. Especially impossible ones. They passed through settlements too small to have names, trading posts where suspicious eyes followed them. An Apache woman, an old white cowboy, an injured half-breed boy, and 2 prisoners bleeding through their bandages. They were a story people would tell, embellishing it until truth and fiction became impossible to separate. Jake didn't care. Let them talk. Talk was cheap, and action was what mattered. On the second night, Tommy asked Jake about his life, what it was like to grow old alone, to have no family, no home beyond what you could carry on your horse. Jake answered honestly, it was lonely sometimes, yes. Hard often. But it was also free in a way most people never experienced. No one to answer to, no one to disappoint, no expectations to live up to or down to, just a man and the land and whatever came next. Tommy thought about that for a long time. Then he asked if Jake ever regretted it, the loneliness. Jake stared into the fire, considering. Yeah, he admitted. Sometimes he did. There were nights when the silence felt like it might crush him, when he'd have given anything for a voice to break the darkness. But those moments passed, and the morning always came, and with it the reminder that he'd chosen this life freely. That had to mean something. Maria watched them talk, her expression unreadable. Later, after Tommy had fallen asleep, she told Jake he was good with the boy. Natural teacher, she said. Maybe when Tommy built his school, Jake could help. Teach the children about horses and survival, and how to live with integrity in a world that often rewarded the opposite. Jake laughed at that, but not unkindly. Him? A teacher? He could barely write his own name, had no education beyond what life had beaten into him. But Maria was serious. The best teachers taught by example, she insisted, and Jake had spent a lifetime learning lessons worth passing on. Maybe it was time he stopped wandering and found a place to plant roots, even temporary ones. The idea unsettled Jake more than he wanted to admit. He'd spent so long moving that the thought of staying anywhere felt suffocating. But he didn't dismiss it outright. Something about Tommy's earnest hope, about Maria's quiet strength, made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was still room in his life for something beyond the endless horizon. They reached Fort Davis on the afternoon of the third day. The town was bigger than Jake expected, with actual streets and a proper jail. The marshal was a hard-faced man named Roy Dixon, who listened to their story with skepticism that gradually turned to belief as the details piled up. Pete Carson tried to spin his own version, claiming they'd hired Tommy as a guide and the boy had attacked them unprovoked. Nobody believed him. Marshal Dixon took custody of the prisoners, promising they'd face justice for kidnapping and assault at minimum. He thanked Jake and Maria formally, noting their names for the official report. There might be a reward from the territorial government, he mentioned, though paperwork took time and guarantees were impossible. Jake waved that away. They hadn't done this for money. The town doctor examined Tommy, confirming Maria's assessment. Bruised ribs, facial contusions, general battering, but nothing permanently damaged. The boy was young and strong. He'd heal. The doctor offered to keep Tommy overnight for observation, but Maria refused. She wanted her son where she could see him, under her protection. The doctor understood and didn't push. Jake found them rooms at a boarding house run by a widow named Ruth Coleman. She was Apache friendly, rare enough in these parts, and offered them fair rates. More importantly, she didn't ask questions or make judgments about the strange group renting her rooms. Jake paid for 2 nights, figuring they all needed rest before deciding what came next. That evening, they ate together in the boarding house dining room. Real food, hot and plentiful, better than anything they'd had on the trail. Tommy devoured his meal despite his swollen face, the resilience of youth showing through. Other diners stared, whispered, but Ruth shut down any overt hostility with sharp glances. Her house, her rules. After dinner, Maria took Tommy upstairs to rest. Jake remained in the common room, smoking his pipe and watching the street through the window. Fort Davis was booming. People everywhere chasing prosperity or fleeing poverty or just drifting through like tumbleweeds. He felt disconnected from it all. An artifact from an earlier time when things seemed simpler and clearer. Maria came back down an hour later. Tommy was asleep, she reported, already looking better after food and rest. She sat across from Jake, accepting coffee from Ruth. They drank in silence for a while, 2 people who'd shared danger and now had to figure out what came after. Maria spoke first. She was taking Tommy back to her land tomorrow. He'd finish healing there, surrounded by what remained of their people. Then she'd see about getting him proper schooling, maybe at the mission school 2 territories over. He was too smart to waste on manual labor or drifting. He deserved a chance to become what he dreamed of being. Jake nodded. That was good, the right choice. He'd head out too, probably west toward California. He'd heard there was work in the vineyards, and he'd never seen the ocean. Might as well, while he still could. They'd go their separate ways. Their brief alliance ended as quickly as it had formed. Except Maria had a different idea. She asked Jake to come with them, at least for a while. Her land was good, plenty of space, and she could use help with the horses she was breeding. More than that, Tommy had taken to Jake. The boy needed male guidance, someone who could teach him practical skills alongside his book learning. Someone who understood what it meant to survive in a world that didn't always want you. Jake protested. He was too old, too set in his ways. He'd be a burden, not a help. Maria cut through his objections with simple logic. He was here, wasn't he? He'd helped when it mattered. That proved he wasn't useless. And everyone needed somewhere to belong. Even stubborn old cowboys who pretended otherwise. Jake wanted to refuse. Wanted to maintain his independence, his freedom to ride away whenever the mood struck. But something in Maria's offer pulled at him. Maybe it was the thought of finally having a purpose beyond survival. Maybe it was the memory of her husband's kindness all those years ago, a debt he could now repay. Maybe he was just tired of being alone. He told Maria he'd think about it. She smiled slightly, as if that was agreement enough. They finished their coffee and parted for the night, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts. Through the window, stars appeared, one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there was the trail west, the ocean he'd never seen, the endless horizon that had defined his life. But in this room, in this moment, was the possibility of something different. Something that looked a lot like home. Jake slept poorly that night. Decades of habit warring with new possibilities. By dawn, he still hadn't decided. He went downstairs to find Maria and Tommy already up, preparing to leave. The boy looked better, the swelling reduced, color returning to his face. He smiled when he saw Jake, a genuine expression of friendship that made Jake's chest tighten unexpectedly. They loaded their supplies, checked the horses, settled their accounts with Ruth. The morning was cool and clear, perfect traveling weather. Marshal Dixon stopped by to thank them again and confirmed that Pete Carson and his associate would be held for trial. The other 3 men had been caught trying to cross into Mexico, he added. They'd all face justice, one way or another. As they prepared to mount up, Tommy approached Jake. The boy held out his hand formally, adult style. He thanked Jake for saving his life, for treating him like he mattered. His voice cracked slightly with emotion, but his grip was firm and steady. Jake shook his hand, feeling the calluses that proved the boy wasn't afraid of hard work, and told him he'd done well. Survived when many wouldn't have. That took courage. Real courage, not the false kind that came from carrying a gun. Maria mounted her horse, then helped Tommy up behind her. She looked at Jake expectantly. The old cowboy stood beside his own horse, one hand on the saddle, the weight of decision pressing down on him. West was the ocean and whatever lay beyond. North was Maria's land and a chance at something he'd never had. East and south were just more of the same, endless drifting. Jake made his choice. He swung up into the saddle, his joints protesting as always, and turned his horse north. Maria's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes acknowledged what his action meant. Tommy grinned outright, excited in the way only young people could be about uncertain futures. They rode out of Fort Davis together, 3 people who'd found each other through violence and necessity. The town fell away behind them, replaced by open country that stretched toward distant mountains. The land was hard but beautiful, unforgiving but honest. It demanded everything from those who lived on it and gave back just enough to make survival possible. Jake had ridden these trails for decades, always alone, always moving. Now he rode with company towards something that might become home if he let it. The change felt strange, uncomfortable, like breaking in new boots. But sometimes discomfort meant growth. Sometimes it meant you were still capable of becoming something other than what you'd always been. They traveled through the morning, following old Apache paths that wound through the high desert. Maria pointed out landmarks, shared stories about what had happened at various locations, a battle here, a birth there, the full history of a people written in rock and sand and blood. Tommy added his own observations, seeing the land through younger eyes that imagined not just what was, but what could be. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat. Jake shared out his remaining jerky while Maria distributed water from her canteen. They sat in the shade of a massive boulder, enjoying the brief respite from the sun's intensity. Tommy asked questions about everything, his natural curiosity undimmed by recent trauma. What did Jake think about this or that? How did one train a horse properly? What was the secret to surviving alone for so long? Jake answered each question thoughtfully, realizing that teaching came more naturally than he'd expected. He knew things worth knowing, skills earned through experience rather than books. How to read weather patterns, how to find water, how to judge character by watching how someone treated their animals, small wisdoms accumulated over a lifetime of paying attention. Maria watched them interact with quiet satisfaction. This was working already, the mentorship forming naturally. Tommy needed this, someone who understood the masculine side of surviving in harsh country, but who also respected the Apache traditions Maria taught. A bridge between worlds, that's what Jake could be. That's what Tommy needed to become. They rode on through the afternoon, the land gradually changing as they moved higher into rough country. Juniper and piñon replaced the sparse desert vegetation, and the air grew slightly cooler. This was Apache land, not in the legal sense that white men recognized, but in the deeper sense of belonging that came from generations of living and dying in a place. As the sun began its descent, they crested a ridge and Maria pointed ahead. Below, in a protected valley, Jake saw her land. A small ranch with a sturdy cabin, corrals holding perhaps 20 horses, and a creek that ran year-round based on the vegetation around it. It was modest but well-maintained, carved out through sheer determination and hard work, a place that demanded respect. They rode down into the valley as shadows lengthened. Dogs emerged from the cabin, barking announcements of arrival. An older Apache woman came out, her face breaking into relief when she saw Maria and Tommy. This was Maria's aunt, Jake learned, who'd been watching the place during their absence. The two women embraced, speaking rapidly in Apache while Tommy hugged his great-aunt carefully, mindful of his injuries. Jake hung back, suddenly uncertain about his presence. He was an outsider here, a white man in Apache space. Maria noticed his hesitation and beckoned him forward. She introduced him to her aunt, who studied Jake with eyes that missed nothing. Whatever she saw must have passed inspection because she nodded once and welcomed him in accented English. They settled the horses first, Jake working automatically to unsaddle and brush them down. The work was familiar, comforting in its routine. Tommy tried to help, but Maria ordered him inside to rest. The boy protested but obeyed, recognizing when his mother's tone allowed no argument. Jake hid a smile at that. Some things transcended culture. Mothers were mothers everywhere. Inside the cabin, Jake found a space that managed to be both simple and comfortable. Wooden floors, solid furniture, an efficient iron stove. Maria's aunt had prepared a meal, some kind of stew that filled the cabin with savory smells. They ate together around a rough table, talking about nothing important, letting tension drain away in the presence of food and safety. After dinner, Maria showed Jake the outbuilding where he could sleep. It was small but weatherproof, with a decent bed and room for his gear, more luxury than he'd had in years of sleeping rough under stars or in whatever shelter presented itself. He thanked her, and meant it. This was a gift, being welcomed here. He'd try not to waste it. That night, lying on an actual mattress for the first time in months, Jake stared at the ceiling and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He'd spent so long alone that being part of something, even temporarily, felt foreign. But foreignness wasn't always bad. Sometimes it was just different, and different could become familiar given time. He'd give it that time, he decided. See where this path led before judging whether it was right or wrong. Morning came with rooster crows and the sound of Maria moving around the ranch. Jake rose, dressed, and went outside to find her already working with the horses. She explained her breeding program as they worked side by side, her goals and methods. She was trying to develop a line that combined Apache pony toughness with the size and speed of American horses. Smart breeding, Jake thought. The best of both worlds, if she could pull it off. Tommy appeared after a while, still moving carefully but determined to help. Maria assigned him light tasks that kept him busy without overtaxing his healing body. The boy worked with focused intensity, proving himself capable despite his injuries. Jake recognized that drive. Tommy was trying to erase the shame of being captured, of needing rescue. No amount of talking would convince him he had nothing to be ashamed of. Only time and accomplishment would do that. They fell into a routine over the following days. Jake handled the heavy work. Maria managed the breeding program. Tommy did what he could while continuing to heal. Maria's aunt cooked, maintained the cabin, and watched over them all with the quiet authority of age. It was almost like being part of a family, Jake realized. Not quite, because family shared blood and history, but close enough to give him a glimpse of what he'd missed. Tommy's formal education began again, too. Maria worked with him on reading and arithmetic each evening, supplementing the lessons with history and Apache traditions. Jake found himself drawn into these sessions, learning alongside the boy. He'd never had much schooling, and it was humbling to discover how much he didn't know. But humility was good for the soul, kept a man from getting too proud. One evening, about 2 weeks after their arrival, Tommy asked Jake if he was staying or leaving. The boy's tone was casual, but his eyes betrayed anxiety. He'd grown attached to Jake, come to rely on his presence. Jake didn't have a good answer. He'd planned to stay a few weeks, help out, then move on. But weeks had turned into something more comfortable than he'd expected, and the urge to drift had faded considerably. Maria answered for him. She said Jake would stay as long as he wanted, leave whenever he needed to, and return if he chose. No obligations, no expectations beyond honesty and hard work. That was the deal, take it or leave it. Jake appreciated her directness. It removed pressure while leaving possibility open. He could live with that arrangement. The seasons began to change, autumn approaching with cooler nights and different light. Jake realized with some surprise that he'd been at Maria's ranch for nearly 2 months. Time had slipped past while he'd been busy with horses and repairs and teaching Tommy practical skills. He was more settled than he'd been in decades, and the strangest part was that it felt right. They had visitors occasionally, Apache families stopping by to trade or share news, white ranchers from neighboring properties conducting business. Both groups treated Jake warily at first, unsure how to categorize an old white cowboy living on Apache land. But Maria vouched for him, and gradually people accepted his presence. He was just Jake, the old cowboy who helped out. Simple enough. Tommy continued healing in body and spirit. The physical injuries faded completely, but the emotional ones took longer. He had nightmares sometimes, waking up gasping from dreams of captivity. Maria would comfort him, but increasingly Tommy sought out Jake too. They'd sit outside under the stars, Jake telling stories about his life while Tommy worked through his fear. Words helped, but so did time and the security of knowing he was safe. The boy's plans for his school became more concrete. He corresponded with a mission priest who had agreed to help with curriculum development. He practiced teaching by instructing younger Apache children who came to the ranch occasionally. Jake watched him work and saw a natural gift for explaining complex ideas simply. The boy would make a good teacher if he got the chance, if the world allowed him space to succeed. Winter arrived gradually, bringing cold rains and occasional snow to the high country. The ranch work shifted to maintenance and indoor tasks. Jake found himself spending more time in the cabin, sitting by the fire while Maria sewed or Tommy studied. It was domestic in a way his life had never been, peaceful. He'd never thought peace was something he wanted, but now that he had it, he was reluctant to let go. Maria's aunt passed away quietly in her sleep one cold January night. They buried her on the hillside overlooking the valley, marking her grave with stones arranged in traditional patterns. The local Apache community came to pay respects, sharing memories and prayers. Jake stood at the edge of the gathering, respectfully outside the circle of mourners, but present nonetheless. Maria caught his eye once and nodded slightly, acknowledging his support. After the funeral, the ranch felt emptier despite being physically unchanged. Maria's aunt had been a quiet presence, but her absence created a vacuum. Maria threw herself into work, avoiding grief through activity. Tommy retreated into his studies, processing loss in his own way. Jake did what he could, which was simply being there and keeping things running. Sometimes that was enough. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The grass greened, flowers bloomed in unexpected places, and life reasserted itself. They increased the horse breeding program, adding new stock and expanding the corrals. Tommy, now fully grown and stronger than he looked, took on more responsibility. He was becoming a man, Jake realized. Still young, still learning, but no longer the frightened boy they'd rescued. One warm evening in April, they sat outside after dinner watching the sunset paint the sky impossible colors. Tommy mentioned his school plans again. He'd found a piece of land not far from the ranch where he could build. He'd been saving money from selling horses and doing odd jobs. Another year, maybe 2, and he'd have enough to start construction. Just a small building at first, room for maybe 10 students, but it would be a beginning. Boy listed things off: lumber, nails, windows, a stove for winter. Labor to raise the walls and roof. Someone who knew construction basics to prevent costly mistakes. He was trying to figure out how to afford it all while still maintaining his savings for supplies and books. It was a puzzle with no easy solution. Maria had been listening quietly. She offered her land if that would help, a plot near the creek with good access. That would save Tommy from buying property, from dealing with legal complications of an Apache owning land in white-controlled territory. Tommy was grateful but worried about taking advantage. Maria shut that down quickly. Family helped family, period. No advantage, just support. Jake found himself offering too. He'd worked construction in his younger days, knew how to raise a building that wouldn't fall down in the first storm. He could provide labor and knowledge if Tommy could wait until after the busy summer season. The boy's face lit up with gratitude and excitement. This was happening, actually happening. His dream was becoming possible. They spent the summer planning when they weren't working. Jake sketched out rough designs based on Tommy's vision. One large room for lessons, a smaller office for the teacher, a porch where students could eat lunch. Simple but functional. They'd priced out materials, figured out logistics, made lists and budgets and contingency plans. Maria contributed wherever she could, offering suggestions from her own experience building and maintaining the ranch. By autumn, they were ready to begin. Tommy had enough money saved, barely, and they'd found a sawmill willing to sell lumber at fair prices. Local Apache families offered to help with labor, recognizing the importance of what Tommy was attempting. Even some white ranchers contributed, either out of genuine support or wanting to appear generous. Jake didn't care about motives. Help was help. The construction took 3 months of hard work. They raised walls, set beams, shingled the roof. Jake's old skills came back quickly, muscle memory taking over when knowledge faded. Tommy proved surprisingly capable with tools, willing to learn and quick to understand structural principles. Maria managed logistics, keeping everyone fed and supplied. It was a community effort in the truest sense. The school opened in January, just 1 year after Maria's aunt had died. 10 students enrolled initially, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Some were Apache, some white. One was the child of a black homesteader from the next valley. Tommy had made good on his promise. His classroom welcomed everyone willing to learn. The building might be small and the resources limited, but the principle was sound. Jake attended the opening ceremony, standing in the back while Tommy gave a short speech about education and opportunity. The boy had become articulate, confident in his vision. Jake felt something unfamiliar swelling in his chest. Pride, he realized. He was proud of Tommy, proud of Maria, proud even of himself for contributing to something meaningful. It was a strange feeling for a man who'd spent most of his life just surviving. After the ceremony, Tommy pulled Jake aside. He wanted Jake to help teach, he said. Not reading and writing, but practical skills. How to care for animals, how to work with your hands, how to survive if circumstances demanded it. The children needed those skills as much as academic knowledge. Jake protested that he wasn't a teacher, but Tommy just smiled. He'd been learning from Jake for over a year now. Jake was absolutely a teacher, whether he admitted it or not. So Jake found himself standing in front of 10 young faces twice a week, teaching them things he'd learned through decades of trial and error. How to gentle a horse using patience instead of force. How to read the sky for weather changes. How to fix a broken tool with limited resources. The children listened intently, asking questions that made Jake think harder about what he knew and why. It was exhausting and terrifying, and surprisingly satisfying. The school became the center of something larger. Parents would linger after dropping off their children, talking with each other across cultural and racial lines that usually separated people. Tommy encouraged this, seeing it as proof that his vision could work. If children learned together, maybe their parents could too. Maybe the next generation would have less hate and fear dividing them. Jake watched all of this with bemused wonder. He'd stumbled into helping create something important, something that might outlast them all. His contribution was small, just an old cowboy teaching kids how to care for horses and fix fences. But small contributions added up. Tommy had taught him that. Every person who chose to build instead of destroy, to connect instead of separate, moved the world slightly towards something better. Maria's ranch thrived, too. Her breeding program was producing exactly what she'd envisioned. Tough, intelligent horses that could work all day and still have energy. Buyers came from increasing distances, drawn by the quality of her stock and her reputation for fair dealing. She was succeeding in a world that often tried to ensure Apache failure, and she did it through competence and determination that couldn't be denied. 2 years after Jake had first arrived, he found himself sitting in the same spot where he'd camped with Maria and Tommy after the rescue. The old trading post was still abandoned, the town still dead. But everything else had changed. He had a place now, people who depended on him, a purpose beyond the next mile of trail. His horse was stabled at Maria's ranch, content and well-fed. His gear was stored in the outbuilding he still thought of as his room, though he knew he could stay in the main cabin if he wanted. He chose the separate space because he needed that small assertion of independence, that reminder that he could leave if necessary. But he wouldn't leave. Not anymore. He'd found what every wanderer secretly seeks without admitting it. He'd found home. In this unlikely place with this unlikely family that wasn't family but was somehow better than most families he'd known. An old cowboy, an Apache widow, and a half-breed dreamer building something worth building in the middle of nowhere. It was absurd and perfect and exactly where he needed to be. The sun set over the distant mountains, painting the sky the same impossible colors it had on that first evening. Jake finished his coffee, stood creaking joints protesting as always, and headed back toward the ranch. Tomorrow he'd help Tommy repair a section of roof at the school. After that, he'd work with Maria on training a particularly stubborn yearling. The day after, that would bring its own challenges and small victories. A life of routine and purpose instead of endless drifting. He'd choose this life every time, given the chance, though he'd never admit it out loud. Some things were better left unsaid, felt in the doing rather than the telling. That was wisdom too, hard-earned and finally understood. The old cowboy had found his place at last, and that was enough.